Hey, I'm Austin, and today on Animal Quests, I've gathered some of the most preventable and haunting animal fatalities ever documented. From a Manchester apartment where a routine snake handling demonstration in front of a friend ended with paramedics arriving too late, to a crowded residential yard in India where a volunteer snake rescuer discovered that willingness alone isn't the same as training. But first, let's jump to the first story of the snake owner, Elena Varga. It was August 12, 2017, and the afternoon heat in Tampa, Florida, had settled into the kind of suffocating stillness that defines the height of a Gulf Coast summer. The humidity was absolute, the air outside heavy and white with haze, and the sun pressed down on the city with an intensity that kept most people indoors behind closed blinds and running air conditioning. Inside one particular rental home in a quiet residential neighborhood, the curtains had been drawn for reasons that had nothing to do with the heat. Elena Varga was 34 years old. To neighbors, she was a quiet and self-contained woman who kept irregular hours, rarely had visitors, and deflected questions about her home with practiced vagueness. She had held various jobs over the years, nothing that drew attention, nothing that required her to maintain a professional reputation outside of showing up. What defined her life, in the way that an obsession quietly reorganizes a person's entire existence around itself, was her collection. Behind the walls of that rental home lived more than 40 snakes. If I were in that situation, the space would already be the first problem, not the animal. The collection had grown incrementally, the way collections do. One animal, then several, then a number that had long since crossed the threshold of what the space and her resources could safely accommodate. Among them were several large constrictors that exceeded the legal limits her municipality had established for private keeping. Animal control had been to the property before. That's how it usually happens. Nothing feels wrong until it already is. Warnings had been issued and documented. Inspectors had cited unsafe housing conditions and flagged her practice of handling large animals alone, without assistance, in spaces that were too small and too cluttered to allow for any meaningful control. None of it had produced a change in how she operated. The largest animal in her collection was a reticulated python. It measured 19 feet. To put that in context, 19 feet is longer than most living rooms, not in a zoo enclosure behind glass, in a rental home, in a back room, with one person. Reticulated pythons are the longest snake species on Earth. Adults are capable of generating constriction force that, in confined conditions and without assistance, an adult human may be unable to overcome. They are not domesticated. Years of captive feeding do not alter the fundamental wiring of their nervous system, and that nervous system is vulnerable to feeding responses that can override habituation to handlers when strong feeding cues, heat, movement, and scent are present. On that afternoon, Elena entered a small room in the back of the house to carry out a feeding. The room was cluttered with enclosures, substrate, equipment, and the general accumulation of a collection that had outgrown its space. There was barely room to move. She sat low, close to the enclosure, her back against the wall of stacked equipment behind her, in a position that placed her body within the animal's immediate range. She did not have a hook in her hand. There was no second person in the home. What Elena encountered when she reached into that enclosure was a snake in a full feeding response. At that point, knowing what to do wouldn't matter if there's nowhere to apply it. The feeding response in large pythons is not a gradual escalation. It is fast, and it is indiscriminate. It is triggered by the convergence of heat, movement, and prey scent, and once activated, it does not pause to evaluate. The snake struck and immediately began coiling at the point of contact, her forearm, which the first loop pinned against the side of the enclosure before she could pull it back. As the snake repositioned for tighter leverage, additional coils spread across her torso and upper chest. Elena was seated in a room with walls on multiple sides, furniture and enclosures filling the remaining space. She had no room to stand. She had no angle from which to push back with her full body weight, the leverage that a person needs to unwind a large constrictor, which requires not just strength but space, positioning, and ideally a second pair of hands working simultaneously, was entirely unavailable to her. She struggled. The struggling made it worse. Constrictors tighten in response to resistance, a reflex calibrated by evolution to prevent prey from escaping once coiling has begun. Every movement Elena made fed directly into the mechanism that was killing her. The coils spread further. Compression on her chest reduced her ability to draw breath. The pressure on her neck compressed the vessels carrying blood to and from her brain. These two effects, respiratory restriction and circulatory obstruction, can produce loss of consciousness in a short period of time, especially once pressure affects both breathing and blood flow simultaneously. There was no one in the house. There was no tool within reach. The walls of the cluttered room had removed every option that might have created a different outcome. Elena Varga died from asphyxiation due to constriction, alone in a room she had entered hundreds of times before, with an animal she had kept for years and believed she understood. Nothing about it would feel sudden in hindsight, only inevitable. When authorities arrived, they documented what they found: the illegal collection, the inadequate space, the absence of any emergency equipment, and no evidence of the secondary handler that professional protocols for large constrictor keeping require. Prior inspections had cited unsafe conditions and flagged specific concerns about solo handling. Those inspectors had not predicted this exact outcome, so much as identified the general category of risk that the conditions represented. The kind of documentation that reads differently in retrospect than it did at the time it was written. One death had been warned into existence, anticipated by every inspector who had seen the conditions. The next required no warnings, because he had never believed the animal in front of him was the problem. It was June 3rd, 2016, and the morning in Brisbane, Australia carried the mild, dry clarity that arrives in Queensland in the early weeks of winter. The sky a pale, even blue, the air cool enough to make outdoor movement comfortable, and the ground firm underfoot. It was the kind of morning that felt entirely safe, in the way that open landscapes often do before something goes wrong. That kind of weather has a way of disguising risk. It doesn't look like anything can go wrong until it already has. Mark Jensen was 28 years old and had spent years building a personal identity around proximity to dangerous animals. He filmed his encounters and shared them, cultivating an audience drawn to the spectacle of a person handling creatures that most people would cross a road to avoid. He was known for it. It had become his thing. The casual confidence, the close range, the relaxed demeanor in the presence of animals whose potential for harm was part of the appeal. Experience without interruption often gets mistaken for control. He had no formal qualifications in herpetology or wildlife management. He had not completed any certified training in venomous snake handling. What he had was experience, a growing catalog of encounters that had not killed him, and the conviction that this track record constituted a kind of expertise. That conviction was the most dangerous thing about him. On that morning, Mark located an eastern brown snake. He moved to pick it up by hand while his camera was recording. The eastern brown snake holds a specific and well-documented position in the global hierarchy of dangerous reptiles. It is responsible for more snakebite fatalities in Australia than any other species. It is not large by world standards, but size is not the relevant variable. What matters is its disposition and its venom. Eastern brown snakes are highly defensive animals. They will attempt to escape, but when cornered or handled, they respond with speed and precision. They are capable of extremely rapid defensive strikes, and they deliver venom that attacks the body through two simultaneous mechanisms, disrupting the body's clotting system, which can lead to dangerous bleeding, hemorrhage, and systemic coagulopathy, and attacking the nervous system, which can cause paralysis and respiratory failure, effects that, as they progress without intervention, lead to circulatory collapse and ultimately cardiac arrest. A significant and well-documented proportion of serious eastern brown bites occur during handling attempts by people who are not professionally equipped for the task. This is not because the snake is uniquely aggressive. It is because close-range hand contact removes the distance that is the animal's primary deterrent. When that distance is gone, the snake uses the only other tool available to it. Mark was bitten on the forearm. The severity of an event like this isn't always readable in real time. The snake struck and released, as eastern browns frequently do, and Mark withdrew from the encounter upright and functional. He did not apply a pressure bandage. He remained on his feet and moving, which, in the case of eastern brown envenomation, accelerates the spread of venom through the lymphatic system. He assessed the bite. He looked at the wound. He evaluated how he felt. He was moving. He was coherent. He noted the absence of immediate dramatic symptoms and reached a conclusion that was intuitive, understandable, and catastrophically wrong. He decided it was a dry bite. They do occur, but the eastern brown's venom does not always announce itself immediately. The coagulopathy and neurological effects can develop over hours, spreading through the bloodstream while the person bitten remains functional and convinces themselves the danger has passed. The window for effective treatment exists, but it is not unlimited, and every hour spent outside of care is an hour the venom uses to progress. Mark did not seek immediate treatment. He delayed. The most dangerous part of delayed envenomation is how normal everything still feels. He monitored himself, but the absence of immediate symptoms was not evidence of safety. It was the eastern brown's venom doing what it does, quietly, before the body's systems begin to fail. Several hours after the bite, Mark collapsed. By the time the full severity of the envenomation became undeniable, the delay had closed the window in which intervention could have reversed the damage. The systemic effects had progressed too far. Mark Jensen died from envenomation, not from the bite itself, which was over in a fraction of a second, but from the hours he spent afterward convinced that what had happened was manageable. The animal that killed him had behaved with complete biological consistency. It had been approached, it had defended itself, and it had moved on. The fatal variable in the sequence was entirely human. The delay, the misread of the situation, and the confidence that had made caution feel unnecessary. Viewed in sequence, the outcome stops looking sudden and starts looking structured. Mark Jensen died in an open field, upright and moving, convincing himself the worst had already passed. The next case involves someone who built the safest possible environment for a dangerous animal and died inside it. It was September 14, 2015, and the spring air in São Paulo, Brazil, was warm and thickening toward the humidity that the approaching wet season would bring. Inside Carla Mendes's home, a different kind of climate prevailed, controlled, humid, and carefully maintained for the large animal that lived in the custom-built enclosure she had spent considerable time and money constructing. What looks controlled from the outside still carries the same biological conditions inside. Carla Mendes was 36 years old, a dedicated keeper who had invested seriously in her setup. The enclosure she had built for her African rock python was a substantial indoor environment, reinforced walls, climate control calibrated to the animal's needs, basking platforms arranged at appropriate gradients, and a deep soaking pool large enough to allow full submersion. She had designed it with the kind of attention to naturalistic detail that distinguishes committed private keepers from casual ones. She had built it herself, maintained it herself, and entered it herself for cleaning, a routine she carried out regularly while the python remained inside. Tasks that require caution begin to feel routine when nothing has interrupted them before. African rock pythons are among the largest snake species in the world. Large individuals can exceed 150 pounds, with a muscular density and striking speed that photographs consistently underrepresent. What distinguishes them from many other large constrictors is not just their size, it is their temperament. They are highly reactive animals, known among experienced keepers for their defensive intensity at close range. In confined environments, sudden close-range disturbance can be enough to trigger a defensive strike response. They do not require a feeding context to respond with force. That response is not a decision. It is a reflex, fast, powerful, and shaped by millions of years of an animal that survives by securing threats before they can escalate. In the wild, that reflex fires at predators approaching too closely, at disturbances in the immediate environment, at anything that produces the patterns of movement and disturbance the snake interprets as immediate intrusion. In a closed enclosure, it fires at whatever produces the same signature. The fact that the source is a familiar person completing a familiar task is information the snake does not have access to. Nothing about the situation required urgency at that moment, at least from her perspective. On that afternoon, Carla entered the enclosure alone for a routine cleaning session. The python was positioned near the soaking pool. At some point during the process, she slipped on the wet, submerged flooring and fell into the water beside the snake. The fall was sudden. The splash was chaotic. It produced exactly the kind of sudden, close-range disturbance that triggers a defensive response in an animal like this. The snake bit and held. A defensive bite from an African rock python is not a controlled event. The animal bit into her forearm and maintained the grip. The typical opening move of a startled animal in an enclosed space, not a feeding sequence, but a hold that is self-reinforcing by design. Carla was already disoriented from the fall, already off balance in the water, her back pressed against the near wall of the pool enclosure. Her instinct was to pull back from the bite. That movement registered to the snake as escalating threat, and the animal responded by beginning to coil around the bitten arm, one loop anchoring against the concrete lip of the pool, pinning her forearm against it with the kind of fixed-point leverage that her own movements could not overcome. What followed was a sequence rather than a single event. Her bitten arm was effectively fixed at the pool's edge, held in position by the coil braced against the concrete lip. Her free arm was working against that coil, pushing rather than unwinding, and producing no useful displacement. Each attempt to lift herself clear produced the resistance that reinforced the snake's hold. Each struggle in the water cost energy she could not recover. With one arm anchored at the edge and the pool wall behind her, she had no surface from which to generate the leverage needed to push herself upright, and the position placed her airway repeatedly close to the waterline. She could not stand. She could not hold position long enough to keep her head consistently above the surface. The snake was not consuming her. Its coil had found a fixed point against the pool's own structure, and that anchor, combined with where she had fallen, was sufficient. Exhaustion arrived before any of the other factors were resolved. Carla Mendez died from drowning. The python's grip was not the direct clinical cause of death. It was the mechanism that made escape from the water impossible. The enclosure she had built with such care, designed to give the animal the environment its biology required, had become the environment in which she could not survive the animal's reflexive response to her fall. Carla Mendez had no protocols to neglect. She had followed them until a single, uncontrolled moment rendered them irrelevant. What comes next is the opposite. A man who had the protocols, understood them completely, and spent years quietly deciding he no longer needed them. It was April 22nd, 2018, and Phoenix, Arizona was settled into the dry, temperate warmth of mid-spring, the kind of weather that arrives before the desert summer makes outdoor life genuinely punishing. The sky was clear and sharp the way desert skies are in that season, and the heat was manageable, the kind of day that felt ordinary in every respect. On days like this, nothing about the environment signals that anything irreversible is about to happen. Daniel Ruiz, at 43 years old, was experienced. That word carries weight in the context of what happened to him, because his death was not the story of a novice who underestimated a dangerous animal. It was the story of someone who had accumulated enough experience to become genuinely capable, and who had then used that capability as permission to gradually dismantle the practices that made the capability meaningful. He had kept venomous reptiles privately for years. He understood their biology. He understood their behavior. He could read an animal's posture and had done so accurately enough, often enough, that the skill had become reflexive. He knew the protocols, the tools, the two-person handling procedures for high-risk transfers, the discipline of never shortcutting the steps that existed specifically because experience alone is not sufficient protection against an animal that can kill in a fraction of a second. He had simply stopped following them with the consistency that protocols require. The shift had been gradual, as these things are. A shortcut taken once without consequence becomes a shortcut taken regularly. A tool skipped during a routine transfer that went smoothly becomes a tool that starts to feel unnecessary for routine transfers. The gap between what the protocol required and what Daniel actually did on any given day had widened over time, and it had widened invisibly because nothing had gone wrong. Nothing going wrong is not the same as nothing being dangerous. It just feels that way. On that afternoon, Daniel was moving a western diamondback rattlesnake. The transfer was routine, the kind he had performed dozens or hundreds of times. At that stage, the method no longer feels like a decision. It feels like the default. He chose to use hand control instead of a hook. Western diamondback rattlesnakes have a cultural reputation built largely around the warning rattle that precedes many of their defensive interactions. That reputation is not false, but it is incomplete in a way that costs people their lives. Rattlesnakes do not always rattle before they strike. In close-range handling situations, particularly during transfers when the animal is already unsettled, the warning display can be abbreviated or absent entirely. The strike can come before there is any rattling at all, and at the distances involved in hand control, abbreviated warning is functionally no warning. The bite landed on Daniel's hand, a full-contact strike that delivered a substantial venom load into the dense vascular tissue of the hand and wrist. Venom delivered there travels efficiently through the blood vessels and tissue concentrated in that area. The pain and swelling progressed rapidly, significant enough to demand attention, but not immediately incapacitating in the way that might have forced an unambiguous decision. That ambiguity was the problem. He delayed calling for help. Delay in these cases rarely feels like avoidance. It feels like assessment. The same confidence that led to the shortcut also shaped the response to the bite. The person who decided they did not need the tool is often also the person who decides, in the immediate aftermath of envenomation, that they do not yet need outside help. Both decisions emerge from the same source, the belief that experience provides a margin of safety that protocols are designed to supplement. In the hours that followed, the envenomation progressed through its stages. The swelling moved up his hand and into his forearm with the speed that accompanies high-volume envenomation, the tissue distension visible and advancing in a way that should have removed ambiguity earlier than it did. He vomited. His blood pressure dropped, the hypotension that follows significant crotallid envenomation as venom disrupts vascular integrity and fluid begins shifting out of the bloodstream. At some point, his thinking became less clear. The confusion that accompanies hemodynamic compromise as the body's compensatory responses begin to fail. Each of these developments was something Daniel likely recognized as serious. Each of them was also something a person already committed to managing the situation alone might continue, for a time, to believe was still manageable. By the time the severity of his condition made the decision to call for help unavoidable, several hours had passed. The delay had already shaped the outcome, not just in terms of venom progression, but in the compounding tissue damage that had advanced past the point where anti-venom alone could fully reverse it. The intervention that arrived was appropriate, but the combination of a substantial venom load and the time lost had already carried the damage beyond what treatment could recover. He had the knowledge to have survived. He had performed the transfer with the correct tool for years before that afternoon. The thing that killed him was not ignorance and not the absence of skill. It was the slow, invisible erosion of discipline that familiarity produces when it goes unchallenged long enough. Daniel Ruiz had training and let it erode. The next person never had training to begin with. What she had instead was a phone that rang, a willingness to answer it, and a set of improvised tools that had worked enough times to stop feeling improvised. It was July 9th, 2014, and the monsoon had arrived in Kerala, India, with the full force of a season that reorganizes life across the entire region. The rain had been heavy in the days prior, saturating the ground, flooding low spaces, and pushing animals out of the sheltered spots they occupied in dry weather. In residential areas, this meant that encounters with snakes became more frequent, more urgent, and more likely to end badly if the person responding to them was working outside the bounds of their actual training. Priya Nair was a 26-year-old community volunteer. She responded to snake sightings in residential areas. She showed up when people called, assessed the situation, and attempted to remove the animal. She had done it enough times that she had developed a local reputation as someone you could call when a snake appeared somewhere it shouldn't be. In most cases, repetition creates familiarity. In this case, it created confidence in situations that never actually became safer. She was not trained. She had no formal certification in venomous snake handling, no professionally manufactured equipment designed for the task, and no institutional oversight or backup. What she had was a willingness to help and a set of improvised tools, objects that were functional enough to have gotten her through previous encounters without catastrophic consequence, and therefore objects that had come to feel adequate. Tools that survive repeated use without failure tend to get promoted beyond what they were originally meant for. A spectacled cobra had been located in a tight residential yard. Priya arrived to remove it. The spectacled cobra is one of the most recognized snake species in South Asia and one of the most medically significant. Its venom is primarily neurotoxic, targeting the nervous system's ability to maintain the muscular function that controls breathing. In serious envenomations, without rapid treatment, the progression from bite to respiratory failure can be measured in hours, sometimes less, depending on the quantity of venom delivered, the location of the bite, and the physical condition of the person bitten. Spectacled cobras are not ambush predators. They display. When threatened or cornered, they spread their iconic hood, raise the front portion of their body, and produce visible warning signals that communicate their willingness to defend themselves. This display is genuine. It is the animal attempting to resolve the confrontation without physical contact, and in open terrain with room to retreat, it often succeeds. A person who moves away from a displaying cobra, who gives it space and time, usually does not get bitten. The residential yard was tight. There was no direction the snake could retreat that was not blocked by walls, fencing, or the presence of Priya herself. The improvised tools she was using did not give her the working distance that professional equipment provides, the kind of distance that keeps a handler outside the snake's effective strike range while maintaining control over the animal's movement. She was close. The snake was cornered. Repeated close-range disturbance without an escape route increased the likelihood of a defensive strike. The bite was swift and decisive. Priya was bitten during the removal attempt, and the snake delivered venom into the wound. There is no adjustment phase after envenomation, only progression. What followed was a race between the venom's progression and the time required to reach appropriate care, a race shaped by the transportation challenges of the region, the nearest facility equipped with both anti-venom stock and ventilatory support being well over an hour away, and the time that had already elapsed between the bite and any organized response. The venom moved through her system with the efficiency the species is known for. Respiratory function began to fail. The local clinic she was first taken to lacked the mechanical ventilation capacity needed to bridge the time until anti-venom could take effect, the kind of infrastructure gap that determines outcomes in exactly these cases, where the margin is measured in hours, and each one spent in the wrong facility cannot be recovered. By the time she had reached a facility capable of full intervention, the window had closed. Priya Nair died from respiratory respiratory failure caused by envenomation. She had responded to the call the same way she had responded to every other call, with willingness, with the tools she had, and with the experience she had accumulated through repetition rather than through training. The cobra had done what cornered cobras do. The outcome had been shaped by everything that preceded the moment of the bite, the missing training, the inadequate equipment, and the distance that was never quite enough. The same response in a different space would have carried a different probability entirely. Priya Nair died in an open yard, with people around her, in a race against distance and infrastructure. The next case closes all of that down. The space shrinks to a single apartment. The distance to a hospital becomes irrelevant, and there is someone else in the room. It does not help. It was November 27th, 2018, and Manchester, England sat under the low, flat gray sky that defines the city in late autumn, the kind of overcast that blurs the line between afternoon and evening before darkness actually arrives, the air cold and damp with the chill of a northern British winter settling in. Inside a small apartment, the temperature was more controlled, kept warm by central heating. A 14-foot Burmese python lived in an enclosure there, and Liam Carter had been its keeper for long enough that the routines surrounding it had become entirely ordinary to him. Ordinary enough that he had invited a friend over that evening without thinking twice about it. Cold seasons don't reduce risk in captivity. They only move it indoors. Liam was a 32-year-old private keeper, not a professional, not affiliated with any wildlife organization, not operating under any formal oversight. He had kept the python long enough to know its feeding schedule, its behavioral patterns, the way it moved and responded to his presence. He had handled it many times. The handling had become routine, and the routine had become something he no longer thought of as carrying the risk that it did. It had also become something he was comfortable performing in front of others. Familiarity has a social dimension. It encourages demonstration. Joel Marsh, 25, was not a keeper. He was a friend who had been in the apartment before, who knew the snake existed, and who had no particular fear of it. He was there that evening in the ordinary way that friends are present, sitting across the room, watching, asking questions. He was close enough to observe. He was not equipped to intervene in what was about to happen. The apartment was small. Burmese pythons are among the largest snake species in the world. Adult females regularly exceed 15 feet and 150 pounds. They are constrictors, meaning their method of subduing prey involves wrapping around a target and generating pressure sufficient to stop circulation. Safe handling requires space to stand, reposition, and use body mechanics to counter the snake's grip. A small apartment does not provide that space. Earlier that evening, Liam had handled frozen-thawed prey as part of the feeding process. The scent of prey material transfers readily to hands and clothing and does not disappear when the feeding is finished. Residual scent is not a minor detail in constrictor biology. It is part of the trigger system. Residual prey scent can place a large constrictor into a heightened feeding response state, particularly at close range during active handling. Under those conditions, the distinction between handling interaction and feeding stimulus can narrow dangerously. Liam had not fully removed that scent before handling the snake in front of Joel, showing him how it moved, how it responded to being lifted, the way its weight distributed across an arm. It was the kind of casual demonstration that keepers perform for visitors, unremarkable in every way that routine makes things unremarkable. At some point during this, Liam shifted toward the corner of the room, his back moving toward the wall, furniture closing off the space beside him. The snake became active, not a committed strike, but the exploratory, searching movement that precedes a feeding response when scent cues are present and a warm body is in contact range. What removed the remaining margin was not the feeding response alone. As the snake's movement became more insistent, Liam stepped back to reposition, and his foot caught the edge of the couch behind him. He went down to one knee, partially against the wall, the snake's forward portion already across his arm and shoulder. From that position, one knee on the floor, back against the wall, furniture blocking lateral movement on one side, he could not stand. He could not generate the leverage that counters a large constrictor's grip. The snake, anchoring against the furniture and his own body weight, began to coil around the point of contact. Joel saw it happen. He crossed the room. He grabbed at the coils. He pulled. This was the instinctive response, and it was the wrong one. Not because of any failure on his part, but because pulling at individual sections of a large constrictor's coil does not interrupt the mechanism. There is a correct technique for these situations. 2 or more people with specific knowledge, working from the tail end outward, unwinding the coils in sequence. Joel had none of that knowledge. He had his hands and his panic, and a snake that weighed more than he could effectively manage. Each attempt to pull a section free caused the snake to anchor harder against the wall and against Liam's own body weight, the resistance feeding directly into the tight tightening reflex rather than interrupting it. As the snake repositioned for tighter purchase, additional coils spread across Liam's upper torso and chest, not advancing strategically, but anchoring against whatever the animal's movement encountered. The wall behind him, the arm already pinned against his own torso, the furniture edge that had served as its initial anchor point. Each repositioning tightened the existing contact. The snake's body had located two fixed points, the wall and Liam's pinned arm, and was drawing against both simultaneously, a configuration that his remaining free arm could not effectively displace. A coil had settled across the side of his neck and upper chest, pressing against the carotid vessels close to the surface, structures that require relatively little sustained external pressure to compress. Compression on his chest reduced his ability to draw a full breath, reduced oxygen intake, reduced circulation to the brain, with his free arm generating push against a coil it could not unwind, and no stable surface from which to produce upward force. The position became self-reinforcing. Consciousness under those combined conditions does not last long. Joel called emergency services at some point during this. It did not matter in terms of outcome. By the time the call was made, the window for intervention had already closed. Paramedics arrived to a scene that required police and animal control before medical assessment could begin. The snake was still present. Liam Carter was not. The presence of a second person had not made the situation survivable. It had made it witnessed. Joel had done what any person without specialized training would do. He had tried, immediately and physically, to help, and the mechanics of what he was trying to interrupt had not been affected by his effort.